Hey everyone, it's Sam from the Danger Planet, and today we're going to be talking about Horus Heresy 2.0's most unique innovation, reactions. Hey everyone, Sam from the Danger Planet here, and as always, when we talk about Horus Heresy, I'm joined by Mike and Brady. Say hi, guys.
Hey, always happy to be here. Looking forward to discussing reactions.
I come forward and return fire.
Excellent. So, reactions, for those of you who are just getting into Horus Heresy, are a new innovation that has been introduced in 2.0, and they're, in my opinion, one of the most unique gameplay advances that Games Workshop's done. So, Games Workshop games are very famously using the I go, you go system, where you activate your whole army and you roll some dice and you take your opponent's models off the board. And with the exception of them punching you back in the melee fighting phase, typically they don't really get to do much. But in Horus Heresy 2.0, they introduced the concept of reactions. And a reaction is something that you can do on your opponent's turn. The way it works is that during each turn, you have what's called a reaction allotment, which by default is one. That means in each phase, you can make one reaction. And a reaction is basically exactly what it sounds like. It is a reaction to something your opponent is doing. We're going to go over them one at a time, but it's things like shooting back when they shoot you, or shooting at them when they charge, or advancing towards them when they're coming towards you, or even running away if you're sneaky or cowardly. So there's a lot of different things you can do, but it gives you something to think about during your opponent's turn, and it gives you some tactical decisions to make even when you're not the one in the driver's seat. So before we get into the nitty gritty of how these work, I just want to get sort of a high level sense. Mike, how do you feel that reactions really add to the game? What do you think they change relative to how Horus Heresy 1.0 played?
Well, what they changed initially is how the player is thinking. So it's your turn. You now have to be concerned of where your units are, who they're shooting, what they're doing, for the risk that you could have your entire plan foiled by a well-timed, well-placed reaction. You could have one of your best units shot off the board for a poor choice of shooting, or get countercharged, or whatever the case may be. As far as for the game itself, it really does add a fun dynamic to getting both players involved, actively involved, and keeping you thinking about what's going on, even when it's not your turn. I don't have to just sit here and take your shots. I now can disrupt. I can now increase my survivability. I can change the game from my opponent's turn.
So I'm coming from 9th edition and 8th edition, where I do a lot of my more competitive style playing, and that they have stratagems. I love reactions, and man, I can't wait for them to make their way to 40k proper. They have a lot of the things I like about stratagems, which is it really starts separating the good players from the great players on how and when you use them, using them on the right units at the right time. But also, they're so much easier to understand. Again, there's 6, and then each legion gets 1, and then there's like a couple advanced reactions. It is so much easier to memorize all these reactions, and they're all powerful because there's not like 15 of them with another pool of resources. I love reactions so much. They really make the game feel good, and they're a really good skill expression.
Great. So, before we get too into reactions, I'll just go over the high level detail. As I mentioned earlier, you get to make one in every phase under normal circumstances. That's your reaction allotment, and they're locked in each phase. So, for example, in the shooting phase, you can only do 2 specific reactions. You can only do the return fire reaction or the evade reaction. But every army has its own unique reactions as well. So every Space Marine Legion has a special, unique, advanced reaction that only that Legion can do. And these reactions are once per game. There are also, there's a unique reaction for Adeptus Mechanicus, and then there's a couple of other weird advanced reactions that don't really neatly fall into any category. And of course, your reaction allotment of 1 doesn't stay at 1, because every warlord has some ability to increase the number of reactions you can make. In most cases, they just say, if you have this warlord trait, you get to make an additional reaction in the shooting phase, or you get to make an additional reaction in the movement phase. But some of the more unusual ones, like Alfarius or Guilliman or Angron, they either let you choose to make your additional reaction in different phases, depending on choices that you've made different points in the game, or in the case of Angron, he lets you make only one reaction in the movement phase, but you can make it 3 times, which is pretty cool in my opinion. So there's a lot of ways that the way you've built your army changes what reactions you have access to. And finally, just as a little bit of a balancing note, the really big guys in this game, the Knights and Titans, they can only make reactions that are triggered by other big super heavy things. So Knights, Titans, things with 8 or more wounds, it's hard to get their attention, and they're not just going to react to anything any little tactical squad is doing. So Brady, how does these sort of extra reactions that you can get, how do these affect your army building? And when you're creating your roster, are you thinking about sort of what extra reactions you're giving yourself, and does that really inform your choices of what units to take?
100%. One of the things that this edition, you save points by making a bigger squad because your Marines are cheaper after you start buying more. But the other thing you get is an incredible amount of action efficiency. If you shoot at my 10-man tactical squad and they fire back, okay, that's maybe 30 bolter shots if you're in range. If it's a 20-man tactical squad, all right, now we're shooting 60. We're shooting a lot of shots back at you, and so it makes those larger squads more efficient. So I'm looking at a lot of squads now. I mean, like, I could break you into 2, which lets me be in more spots. But if I keep you as 1, especially in those units like TAC Marines, like things with bolters, or other weapons that care about rate of fire, I look at those and go, if I just take you in bigger squads, they may not want to shoot you at all because you're going to start hitting those efficiency breakpoints. So I think about it a lot, and it's usually to bring bigger squads and get the most out of those reactions.
For me, a big point that I look at is what commander am I bringing for my list that gives me the extra reaction in the most prominent phase for the army list that I'm building. Absolutely, when it comes to unit size and what units are best suited for what reactions or legion specific, but I look at kind of where my army strengths are and where those reactions are going to be best put to use. And as an example, as I've stated before, being the Imperial Fist player, I do like having extra in the assault phase. I like being able to have the option to overwatch and to dig in. I think dig in is great for whatever army. We'll get into that more later, but it does really shape how I think about my army, particularly the leader that I'm bringing, combined with the army style I'm playing.
All right, so we're going to just talk about the 6 basic reactions to start with. We're not going to get into the Legion-specific advanced reactions today because we are doing all these Legion-focused videos, which I encourage you to check out if you haven't already. And when we discuss each Legion, we also talk about their advanced reaction in some real detail. We talk about the best way to use it and everything. But those reactions are each once per game only. So most of the time when you're reacting, you're using a basic reaction. Therefore, it's very important to know what they all do and what they are, how they can help you. So we'll start with advance. The advance reaction, it's a movement phase reaction, and it can be triggered when an enemy unit ends their move within 12 inches of your unit and in line of sight. And once they've fully resolved that movement, you can choose to use your reaction to advance. And when you do that, you move a number of inches equal to your unmodified initiative characteristic directly towards the enemy unit that triggered the reaction. Each model in your unit going by the shortest available path. And vehicles instead can just pivot up to 90 degrees and then move 6 inches. So Michael, when would you use this reaction, and what is the use case for a reaction like this that's just getting you closer to your opponent?
There are so many reasons to use this, and while I stated that I do like the assault phase reactions for my army, I think the importance of increasing your mobility and being able to use mobility in your opponent's phase is undervalued in certain in certain events, specifically in positioning closer to an objective, getting closer to a unit you want to charge, getting yourself in range to use template weapons, and potentially an Overwatch if you think you're going to get charged, or and a return fire, whatever the case may be. Some of those a little more convoluted than others, but the mobility in your opponent's phase is huge, and getting closer to your opponent could help you in so many different angles, particularly on the objective or getting closer to the objective, and maybe just limiting that charge distance.
Yeah, there is a lot of reasons you want to get closer to get in touch with the objective. There is some jank if you really position your models correctly and like really think ahead to have a unit that's behind the unit that they may want to charge. You know, your unit B pushes forward and comes at least into parity with unit A, so they potentially have to take a disordered charge and charge both units. It's very challenging, and like I've been in my games trying to engineer scenarios to have units block each other out using advance, because I tend to get the warlord traits with 2 movement phase reactions. But because they really crossed their T's and dotted their I's to your models have to take the shortest route, you really need to like have that perfectly placed, and I haven't fully mastered it, but I'm sure people with like the really big brain positioning, you can get some value out of pushing one of your units forward to suddenly block a better charge for the opponent.
That sounds really frustrating to deal with. The other movement phase reaction is kind of the exact opposite. Withdraw. When you withdraw, again, it's triggered when an enemy ends their move within 12 inches in line of sight of you, and you simply move the same, your unmodified initiative characteristic, directly away by the shortest possible path, which that's a little confusing in this context, but I think it just means you figure out what's the absolute shortest straight line between your unit and their unit, and you just move further along that line. So for, a sneaky Alpha Legion coward like me, this one makes perfect sense. But Brady, how do you use this reaction?
Well, we play very similarly as a sneaky beaky myself. A lot of times I'm pushing forward, trying to get within that 12 inches, with my, for rapid fire. And then, the legions are coming forwards, you fade back. If nothing else, just adding 4 to 5 inches to the opponent's charge is never a bad thing. So you push forward, get your rapid fire, they push forward to try to charge you, you fade back, and then you can really dance in that 10 to 12 inch range, where every time they move in to guarantee a charge, you push 4 inches back and that charge becomes a lot harder to make.
I agree. I think the default use for this is increasing the charge, making it more difficult. I think that's the best use of this most of the time, is when you're considering those charges. You can do something similar to what Brady was talking about with the advance. You can pull yourself back in line with another unit. I've used it to maneuver myself around a rhino to give myself cover. It was tight, but with only 4 inches. But it's a useful ability and a useful tactic. Just to keeping some guys alive, increasing that survivability on a charge, particularly against armies that are more geared towards the aggressive advances, and getting into your units that you don't want them to. Definitely a point being. Also, for movement reactions in general, a great point is some units, particularly those with heavy, aren't able to run. This does give you a chance to get a little extra few inches in there if used the right way.
All right. So sounds like the movement phase reactions are, not particularly surprising. They just move you forward and back. The shooting phase reactions are a little spicier. And so we're going to start with return fire. Now, both shooting phase reactions are specifically triggered when your opponent shoots your unit. Which gives them a lot of control over when your reaction gets triggered. Now, technically, yes, they have some degree of control over when they trigger your movement reactions, because they trigger when they end to move within 12 inches of you. But in practice, a 12-inch bubble all around a unit is very, very, very large. And so your opponent really can't avoid triggering the movement reactions at all. They have to trigger them sometime. But the shooting reactions, they have the ability to just not shoot you. So we're going to start with return fire, as I said. When somebody shoots you and you return fire, Simple, you shoot them back. Now you can't make any indirect attacks, and if you're a vehicle, you can only use your defensive weapons, which means not your big high strength main weapons. And there's also this interesting rule called Wall of Death, which is that if you have a template weapon like a flamer, you can only return fire if they are within 8 inches, and you deal, I think it's D3 hits, rather than just placing the template, which I think is just a balance thing, because otherwise returning fire with a whole squad of templates would just be nightmarish. But yeah, Mike, can you tell us a little bit about return fire and how this one gets used and how it changes the way the game plays out?
Well, you stated it right out the gate when you said that you might not shoot a specific target for fear of getting return fire. And that's a huge piece of the game, considering that a lot of high value targets that I want to shoot and get rid of are big shooters. So the threat of firing at a heavy support squad and giving them a chance to get some good shots in on a unit is always now a threat. So who you're targeting and why you have to consider. You almost have to try to shape your game to make your opponent use their reaction points on something else, so you can try to target those bigger, scarier shooting units. And as I said, this is really prominent with those heavy support squads, those tactical support squads that are just going to be mean in that return fire, that are going to just devastate the unit that's shooting at them.
Yep, I mean this one is kind of that really obvious hammer. It has a very, very obvious use case. Sometimes you can trick people up with, they're like, oh, I'm going to take 1 or 2 shots at your TAC Marine squad, and the TAC Marine squad whips around and just lays down some bolter fire. I've been hit with that from World Eaters. I'm like, oh, I'll like try to snipe out the sergeant, and then they're just like, no, that recon squad's dead. And you're like, oh yeah, bolters can do damage when they're in a large volume. The one thing I think that like this, out of a lot of the rules changes, this is probably one of the ones that like hurts vehicles a lot, because a vehicle is going to pop, it has that movement where like your las cannon heavy support doesn't. So the vehicle like inches out, gets the line of sight, and then the las cannon support squad that dies just turns around and ices the vehicle in return. Where the vehicle will not be able to do that in return if, with the tables being switched. So it really increases that firepower from like your heavy supports and your Marines in general, where it's far less useful on your vehicles, or you're really going to want to rethink and maybe even invest in those pintle mounted weapons.
All right, then the other one, just like how with movement reactions, you've got advance and withdraw, the aggressive and the defensive one. The other shooting reaction is evade. Pretty straightforward. If you take an evade reaction, all of your models get the 5-up shrouded special rule, which is basically a 5-up feel no pain against shooting attacks. And a vehicle, interestingly enough, also gets to evade and get feel no pain, which is kind of unusual. So Brady, how does this one play out? When would you choose to evade rather than return fire, given that we've talked about how return fire is such a strong reaction?
I mean, the most obvious is if you have a unit that either doesn't have guns at all or has kind of weak guns in general. It's also just really good on vehicles that you're trying to keep alive. I've used it on a Fire Raptor before. It's like, okay, I want this thing to live another turn. Let's just keep you alive. It doesn't help you if you're fearless, because Shrouded doesn't apply to fearless. And it also helps you because if they're hitting you, like your Terminators with instant death weapons, like I think las cannons, you won't get your feel no pain, but you can get your Shrouded. So that's like a really fun, like Shrouded and feel no pain can get subverted by different rules. So sometimes you need to lean on your defenses on your really expensive units, and sometimes it can't be a feel no pain, so you can pivot to the Shrouded.
I think this one's crucial for particularly armies that are close combat oriented. It's going to help you get some of those critical units into combat. If you're not always running them in a vehicle or whatever the case may be, or you miss that crucial charge and you need them to survive another turn, it's a great aspect for trying to keep units alive. And as we've kind of seen across the board, my experience is a lot of units do maintain a increased survivability from last edition. This only continues to play to that. And the last kind of big part I would recommend this for would be obviously objectives. Being able to keep a tactical squad an objective. Well, yes, absolutely, I've done the return fire with the tactical squad or breachers, whatever the case may be. A evade is usually what I will use for those more basic troop options to keep them alive in those critical locations like the objectives or trying to push other units out.
All right, so finally, we're going to move on to our charge phase reactions, or assault phase, I guess I should say. Both of these, just like the others, they both trigger under the same specific circumstances. In this case, it will not surprise you to hear that they trigger when your unit gets charged. So the first reaction is one that is extremely familiar to anyone who plays 40K. An old favorite, it's Overwatch. When you get charged, you just shoot them. Again, there's a few restrictions on that. You can't use indirect weapons. Vehicles can only fire defensive weapons, and template weapons use Wall of Death. So all the same ones as return fire. But there's also a bonus that if you're being targeted by the Overwatch attack, you don't get your cover save against shots that are being inflicted as part of the Overwatch attack, which kind of makes sense. They're, charging, bursting out of cover. You can't exactly hide behind a tree while you're charging. So, Michael, how does this Overwatch reaction play into your overall strategy when you're playing game?
This is one you save for that critical charge, the one that you're not looking to get, hopefully to whittle down a few individuals, maybe prevent a double charge if one of the units is a little weaker. It has a lot of roles, as you said, lots of individuals know this from 40K, and a lot of the same rules apply as to when this is best utilized and how it can be utilized. And I'll leave that up to Brady as the more competitive 40K player. But for me, it's basically protecting those heavy weapon squads if someone's bold enough to get close to them.
So I think you all really buried the lead from the 40K perspective. In 40K, you hit on sixes when you do your Overwatch. In this version of Overwatch, you shoot at your full ballistic skill. You can just lay down fire. So if someone tries to bring in some of like the, your despoiler squads or like the weaker assault marines, you can't even with bolters just whittle down that damage that's about to come into you. But again, obviously, you're going to be happier if you have those bigger, stronger weapons. This is just a great one where, melee units want to charge shooting units because that's where they're going to do the most damage. And this allows that shooting unit to get one last gasp before they go down, similar to how return fire works.
Great. And so, again, continuing our pattern of one offensive and one defensive reaction per phase. Now we're going to talk about the last of these 6 core basic reactions, hold the line. Now, unusually, this one doesn't just happen. You actually have to do something. In this case, you have to take a morale check if you're the reacting unit. If that check's successful, though, then the charge counts as disordered. And if you fail, or if you pass the morale check, but the enemy unit fails its charge, then anybody else who charges you is disordered. So it's basically you're just getting ready, you're hiding behind your shields, and you're forcing people to charge you in a disordered way. And so really, what's the benefit to doing that, Brady? When would you pick this over Overwatch?
This was probably one of the reaction when I first read it, I dismissed the most. And once I started using it in game, it's like, this is potentially one of the strongest reactions. So one, disordered charge, like if nothing else, they're -1 attack because they're not going to get their bonus for the charge. But there's a lot of rules that like sudden strike that like give that extra initiative, but it's not if it's disordered. So, people are like, oh, I'll just use it if I don't have guns. It's yes, that's useful, but it's also really good if you want to enable your unit to better fight another melee unit. It really is that anti melee. I'll bring Dark Furies down, and they really live and die on their like I get my sudden strike to go to initiative 5. And so if I'm going to try to bait out that opponent's hold the line. Because if I'm fighting at their initiative 4, it's like, oh, this really expensive unit became a lot less efficient. And so when I see a player go, oh, I'm gonna shoot Overwatch, I like breathe a sigh of relief and say, okay, I'm only gonna lose like 2 or 3, but then I'll probably just win the next combat. And when they hold the line, it's like even against chain swords, I start sweating a little bit more because they're gonna take away a lot of that efficiency I thought I had built into my unit.
I actually think I accidentally called this dig in when we first started. Hold the line is actually my favorite one to use of all the reactions, and I do default to this more than Overwatch. I save Overwatch for the big units that if you're going to charge them, then they're going to do the real damage. This is also particularly great depending on your opponent. And I think that's one of the big things about the reactions is using the right one for your opponent. And this is one where Sons of Horus is a great example. If they're charging with Reavers or Raven Guard, as Brady is saying, there's a lot of advantage from being able to deny that additional attack on the charge, because there are a lot of units that's their strength. It's the numerical superiority of attacks. And as an Imperial Fist player, I use this one pretty regularly. This is why I like to have more in the assault phase, so I can really stutter and stall certain charges and an aggressive push into my line. So hold the line is my go-to in a lot of these cases instead of Overwatch, because I'm going to get more reliability from units like Breachers and even Tactical Marines in surviving against a better combat unit. I can bring you back down to my level.
All right, so those are the 6 basic reactions. We're going to just very quickly talk about 2 of the advanced reactions. Now, as I said, we're not going to talk about the Legion advanced reactions. You can check out our Legion focus videos for that. And there's other advanced reactions in the Liber Mechanica, and I'm sure that there will be more advanced reactions in the Liber Imperium when that comes out for the Custodes and the Sisters of Silence and so on. But there are 2 advanced reactions that are more common, and so we're going to start with the one that's a little bit more, I think, regularly seen, Interceptor. Now, this is a reaction that basically allows you, when an enemy sets something up out of reserve, to take a free pot shot at it. And a lot of different items of war gear give you a free Interceptor reaction. And by free, I mean it often doesn't even count towards your reaction allotment. Sometimes I think it doesn't even count towards the number of reactions that unit can make in a phase. So it's very, very strong. So, Mike, what is it about the Interceptor reaction that you really need to look out for, and how does that change the way you can play the game?
For Interceptor, this is one that I sweat over when I see it. I like to run deep striking armies. I particularly like running Hammerfall. So when I see this in large volume, it's particularly challenging for me because I'm going to start eating shots before I even get a chance to get that charge off, before I even get a chance to really have an effect for my army. So it changes how I do my deep strikes. It changes who I bring to deep strike. I bring more Terminators because I'm hoping they can survive particularly devastating units with that Interceptor rule. And the fact that you could bring this in such a large volume and get so much out of it can, a good player who knows that they're coming against me and they know I'm running a deep striking list could get a decent amount of extra shooting in my own face. And then they still have all of their return fires. They still have their Overwatches. It's a very good rule in this edition, but you do have to pay for it.
Yeah, Interceptor, this is one of those ones I first read and was like, wow, this rule is really powerful, especially seeing like Auspex scanners. It's like, oh, you just do it for free for 10 points. This is so broken. Why would anyone run Deep Strike? This rule is just so good. And then 1, you don't see it as often as like I think sometimes you should. But 2, it also comes down to Deep Strike is potentially the most powerful like new mechanic that they reintroduced mechanic in this edition. So this really does help balance it out, because if Interceptor was hard to come by, things like Hammerfall and other armies that are just like null deploy and then Deep Strike everything would just, in my opinion, just really run roughshod over the game. And so having this as that like yin and yang and that counterbalance is really, really important. If you have the points for it, again, it's kind of like Artificer armor, where you kind of start cutting them because you want to get that next unit in. but you really should make sure you have at least like a unit or two that can do interceptor, and do some damage, especially like if a Terminator brick comes in, or a weak unit of assault marines that are just paper thin, quote unquote, just getting to whittle them down so they don't just run roughshod through your lines.
And so then there's one more we're going to cover pretty quickly. Very interesting little one. It's Combat Air Patrol. It's a reaction that you get if you take a Xiphon Interceptor, and it basically is like a sort of form of Super Interceptor where it starts off the board. If your opponent moves a flyer on the board, the Xiphon gets to immediately pop on and shoot them. Very strange little reaction, but Xiphons are kind of crazy strong right now because they're 105 points and have 3 las cannons. So, Brady, do you have you played against the Xiphon yet? And if so, did this even come up?
Yes. For a while, I thought my Fire Raptor was permanently going to have to stay on the shelf, because we misread how Skyfire for planes work. So basically, every time the Fire Raptor would hit, I'd be hit with full ballistic skill, essentially 3 twin las cannons. The big thing to remember about this one, and kind of to remind your opponent, is Skyfire doesn't trigger in a reaction, for planes at least. So they're basically shooting snapshots at your plane. However, at 105 points, with again essentially 3 twin-linked las cannons, even if you get 1-6, you're probably going to wound that, and you're at least going to do a crew shaken onto again, the Fire Raptor, a unit that's 3 times its points. And then the next turn, you just shoot it down, no problem. So this is a really, really powerful reaction. Just make sure you remember that Skyfire isn't going to be part of it, because they're 105 points. Don't let them shoot down the Fire Raptor immediately when it comes on the board.
I also just think that it has a lot of fun fluff to it. I mean, it is called a Siphon Interceptor. It's running an intercepting route. I think it adds a lot to the flavor of the game. Despite having value to exactly that, you can chink away at some bigger weapons, or bigger flyers, excuse me. But being able to do that, it's just fun. It adds more to the game. It adds a little more flavor, which I think a lot of these reactions do overall. So I particularly enjoy seeing these types of little rules enter the game.
All right, so that's our sort of high-level overview of reactions, but they really have, I think, tactically changed the game. So, Mike, I want to ask you first, what was your initial impression of reactions when you started playing 30K 2.0, and how has your impression changed over the course of the games you've played?
I was really excited to see them. As soon as I saw that they were adding this new addition to it, I thought it was a great improvement. Added a lot to just the fun dynamic of the game, letting me do a little more, participate a little more, and taking out the drawl of kind of just getting shot at during your opponent's turn and just kind of accepting it. So it added a little more dynamic. What surprised me was the strategic and tactical dynamic that it brought to the field, of how much it shaped how I thought, how I built my list, how I run my games, how I do positioning in my turn, to either get the best reaction in the next turn, or to deny a reaction from my opponent, whatever the case may be, or to shift my list around so that I can try to essentially disable my opponent's ability to get an extra reaction when I want to headhunt or look for something particular. So it changed the game in a big way, and definitely for the better. As I said, I was excited about it, and I've only just gotten more excited about it as I continue to learn and delve into these reactions. They might be simple, but there's a lot you can do with them.
My my 9th edition heart just sang, because it's in my opinion, it's a fixed version of stratagems. Like as I said at the start, this can't get ported to current 40K faster. I think reactions have just been an absolute slam dunk. They're easy to pick up and understand. The depth is just there, especially as we've talked about before, how it layers in with things like warlord traits. You may want one effect from the warlord trait, but that other warlord trait gives you the reaction that you want, or the extra reaction that you want. So maybe it changes how you think about like how your whole army kind of comes together and how you're going to face your opponent's army, because they have those same reactions, and especially that like powerful Legion reaction. It is just such a good system, especially because they are still limited to the, I go, you go, you do everything all at once. So this is a really great way to interject into that system without fundamentally taking a lot of extra time, adding a lot of mental headroom. I really couldn't be happier with the reaction system. I just want to see it brought into more games.
Well, that's a ringing endorsement. And so I guess we'll just leave off with a little bit of advice, because reactions are pretty different. They're pretty new. So, Brady, if you're a new player who wants to pick up 30K, what's sort of the one thing you'd advise this person to keep in mind when it comes to reactions when they're playing their first few games or building their first list? Let's talk about just sort of the very level one advice to people of how to maximize the benefit they're getting from reactions.
Make sure every phase you've used a reaction. I see the most common one, and like it would happen to me when I first started playing. You'd get through your whole movement phase and forgot to use a movement phase reaction, or even worse, you got to the end of the shooting or assault phase and you forgot to use a reaction. When you're first starting, don't worry about the best time to use it. Just make sure you use it. Just use reaction every single time and keep switching them up and getting a feel for when, maybe this Las Cannon squad does actually want to evade this time. You're only going to see that by doing reps and just by doing it all the time and making it second nature. It's the same thing I'd give the advice for stratagems in 9th edition. So just use them all the time, make the mistake, and you learn more from making the mistake than holding back.
For me, the thing is, that's great advice. I think that works for a lot of cases and for a lot of individuals to get a lot more comfortable with this new dynamic. For me, it would be a little off to just be cognizant, be aware of what you're using and when you're using it. You don't have to get too advanced into it, but you don't have to use it the first chance you get necessarily. Once you get a little more comfortable, it doesn't have to be the first thing you do. The first guy who fires at you, you don't have to automatically use that return fire or evade. As you get more comfortable with it, start thinking about the dynamics, but just be willing to watch the game a little bit and be prepared to use it. But it doesn't hurt to try to think about when is it best for you. You're going to make the mistake. Brady's right. You're going to make mistakes on it. You're going to run into areas where you use it at the wrong moment, and you're going to see the next move and be like, no, that was the evade I needed to do. But if you start taking the time to think about it and think about what's best for you as you're using them, you're going to have a lot of fun and you're going to get a lot out of those reactions either way.
Well, that's it for reactions for today. So we hope you found this video informative and that you are able to use reactions in your own games of 30K. So if you have a reaction to this video, please leave it in the comments or drop us a like. You can head to our Discord. The link is going to be in the description, where you can talk about Horus Heresy and all the other great games we play on the channel. And if you're really interested in all of our great Horus Heresy content, please subscribe. We're doing Legion focuses. We're doing all kinds of cool tactical tips and looks into different ways to play the game. And we think there'll be something here for you to enjoy. So till next time, thanks for dropping by the Danger Planet.